The phrase hung in the air like a delayed echo. Due to broader budgetary realignments, our annual incentive payouts will be distributed strictly among the executive leadership tier, with one notable exception. The room remained perfectly still when she said it. Not a single leather chair squeaked. Not a single pen clicked against a mahogany table. Just that heavy, rehearsed sentence floating in the sterile atmosphere of the glass-walled boardroom. It was 4:12 in the afternoon. I knew the exact time because the digital clock was mounted right behind her on the frosted glass wall, its bright red numbers practically burning into my vision. Easy to read, and remarkably hard to forget. We deeply appreciate everyone's continued dedication and contribution this quarter, the Chief Financial Officer, Olivia Harper, continued. Her voice was steady, practiced, and entirely devoid of genuine emotion. However, not all operational roles fall within our updated executive incentive structure. She did not say my name out loud. She did not need to speak it. I was the only person sitting at that long table who was not staring down at a freshly printed financial sheet, simply because mine did not have a number printed next to it. My name is Richard Vance. I am 58 years old, and at that precise moment, I was the Senior Director of Systems Architecture at a technology firm that had just posted its highest quarterly revenue in the history of its existence. It was a record-breaking quarter, the kind of phenomenal quarter that generates enthusiastic emails from the Chief Executive Officer, the kind that ends up featured in industry headlines and financial magazines, the kind of quarter that aggressive executives build their entire careers on. And somehow, defying all logical explanation, I was the only individual in that room who did not qualify for a financial bonus. To my immediate left, Julian Thorne carefully adjusted his expensive silver cufflinks. He was in his early 40s, sporting a meticulously styled haircut and an advanced business degree from a prestigious university. He had joined the company a mere 6 months prior and was already sitting at the exact same leadership table that I had worked nearly 19 grueling years to reach. He did not look at me, not even a passing glance. Across the wide table, 2 vice presidents shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats. One of them nervously cleared his throat as if he desperately wanted to say something, but ultimately decided against it. No one asked a single question. No one dared to challenge the blatant inequity of the decision. Because in corporate rooms like that one, unbroken silence is the ultimate form of agreement. Olivia Harper kept talking, rattling off a seemingly endless stream of corporate jargon. She mentioned growth margins, percentage points, and projected fiscal trajectories. I heard absolutely none of it. I was solely focused on looking at the thin paper packet resting in front of me. The first page clearly displayed my name and my official title, followed by a comprehensive summary of the complex performance metrics I had personally designed and implemented over the years. Every single metric was marked green. Every target had been exceeded by a significant margin. The second page was where the anticipated bonus figure should have been printed. Instead, there was just a vast empty blank space. It was not even a zero. It was entirely blank. That was the specific detail that permanently lodged itself in my mind. A zero would have meant something tangible. It would have represented a deliberate calculation, a defined reason, a specific number you could logically argue against. A blank space simply meant that I had not even been factored into the equation at all. "We will be finalizing the executive distributions by Friday afternoon," she announced, smoothly closing her thick leather folder. "If there are any lingering questions, please feel free to reach out to my office." Still, absolutely no one spoke a word. The tense meeting concluded the exact same way these high-level meetings always do. Chairs began sliding back across the carpet. Quiet and inconsequential conversations started in hushed voices, and people quickly collected their scattered papers as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. I remained seated for a few seconds longer than everyone else. It was not because I failed to understand what had just happened, but rather because I was taking the necessary time to ensure I understood it completely and with absolute clarity. I finally stood up, neatly folded the paper packet exactly once, and walked out of the double-glass doors without saying a single word to anyone. No one attempted to stop me, no one called out my name, and that was the exact moment the cold reality truly settled into my bones. This was not a clerical mistake. This was not an administrative oversight. This was a calculated decision that had been firmly made long before I ever walked into that boardroom. A deliberate decision that every other person in that room already knew about except for me. By the time I reached the main elevator bank, I was not yet angry. I was simply clear. I was clear enough to recognize that something fundamental had just irrevocably shifted, not within the corporate structure, but within my own mind. For 19 long years, I had been the reliable foundation, the unseen architect who ensured the intricate digital systems never failed. And for the very first time, I realized a profoundly simple truth. They had just explicitly shown me exactly what that unwavering dedication was worth to them. It was worth absolutely nothing. It was not even worth a single digit on a piece of paper. It was just empty white space. And once you see that undeniable truth so clearly, you can never pretend you did not see it. I originally joined the company when I was 39 years old. Back in those early days, it was not the kind of prestigious place where ambitious people openly bragged about their employment. The foundational systems were incredibly unstable. The core processes were only half-built and constantly failing. The clients only stayed with us because the painful process of migrating to another provider would have been exponentially worse. I came in as a senior systems analyst, holding a decent title but facing a monumental task. I deeply understood how complex digital architecture worked, not just in theoretical academic terms, but in practical chaotic motion. I possessed the rare ability to see precisely where a complicated system would inevitably fail long before the actual failure occurred. In those chaotic early years, fixing things before they catastrophically broke was the entirety of my job. Nobody really noticed at first. That is simply the ungrateful nature of preventative maintenance. When a critical system does not fail, it does not make any loud noise or generate frantic emails. But as the relentless months passed, people began heavily relying on that silent stability. The technical projects grew significantly larger. The integrated systems became vastly more complex. And somewhere along that exhausting journey, I stopped merely fixing immediate problems and started quietly building the robust architectural structure that prevented those problems from ever manifesting. I did not achieve this monumental task entirely alone, but I was undeniably the primary person the frantic executives called when something completely inexplicable happened. My phone would ring at 2 o'clock in the morning. It would ring during quiet weekends. It would ring in the middle of family holidays. There was one particularly brutal year. It must have been around my 7th year with the company, when a massive international client almost terminated their contract over a cascading data corruption issue that had been quietly building for several months. Nobody else could accurately trace the root cause. Nobody else could logically explain it. I stayed locked in the server room for 36 consecutive hours without sleep. I meticulously tracked the complex issue all the way back to a microscopic logic flaw in a legacy process that no one had ever properly documented. I fixed it silently and efficiently. The massive client renewed their contract. There was absolutely no company-wide announcement. There was no public recognition. Beyond a quick, dismissive nod from a stressed manager who had already panicked and moved on to the next looming crisis, that exhausting sequence became a permanent pattern. Diagnose the issue, fix the root cause, stabilize the infrastructure, move on without fanfare. Over the relentless years, I personally built automated systems that effortlessly scaled with the company's rapid growth. I designed fail-safe processes that continued working flawlessly even when careless employees made egregious errors. I created resilient frameworks that brand new hires could easily step into without ever understanding how incredibly fragile things had been before my tenure. And as the company aggressively grew its market share, so did the thick layers of management directly above me. Directors, senior directors, and vice presidents multiplied rapidly. I personally trained some of them. I carefully guided a few of them through their very first genuine operational crisis. Several of them eventually ended up leading large departments that I had once helped establish. I honestly never chased flashy titles or public accolades. That is the simple truth. My entire focus was dedicated to making the complex systems function perfectly, and for a very long time, that quiet satisfaction seemed like enough for me. The salary was consistent. The routine raises came annually, even if they were consistently smaller than they rightfully should have been given my immense contributions. Promotions occasionally happened, although they materialized much slower for me than for the more vocal, politically savvy individuals. I frequently told myself that it all balanced out in the end. Predictable stability possesses its own inherent value, especially when you have a family relying on you. My wife, Sarah Vance, and I had a comfortable house, nearly fully paid off. It was not a massive mansion, but it was plenty for our needs. Our daughter, Chloe Vance, was currently getting ready to start her university education. She was an incredibly smart kid, highly focused on her future. She had ambitious plans, and those plans heavily depended on financial consistency more than anything else. I was not interested in chasing unnecessary risks. I was deeply committed to protecting the stable life I had carefully built, but there was another hidden layer, something I rarely talked about, even to myself in explicitly clear terms. A massive portion of what actually kept the company's systems running smoothly lived exclusively inside my own head. It was not because I intentionally hoarded knowledge to make myself indispensable. It was simply because that is how the organic structure had rapidly grown over the years. Operational processes constantly evolve much faster than official documentation can be written. Interconnected systems change significantly faster than thick instruction manuals ever get updated. And over the immense span of time, I slowly became the sole person who truly knew where all the hidden technical gaps were located. I knew the undocumented shortcuts that worked flawlessly. I knew the temporary workarounds that technically should not exist, but absolutely did. I knew the quiet, late-night fixes that never made it into the official engineering reports. There were entire massive parts of the corporate operation that looked perfectly clean and functional on paper, but in reality, they only worked because I knew exactly when to step in. I knew exactly when to manually adjust a failing server load, or when to quietly reroute a massive data process moments before a catastrophic bottleneck occurred. I did not constantly advertise that immense responsibility. I did not hold my specialized knowledge over anyone's head as a threat. I simply did the grueling work because that is precisely what kept everything perfectly stable. And total stability in a rapidly growing technology company looks exactly like effortless success from the outside, that record-breaking quarter they had just enthusiastically celebrated. The one that triggered the massive bonuses for the executives, it was not the result of one single brilliant strategic decision. It was the direct culmination of 1,000 small, highly technical decisions. Most of those decisions were completely invisible to the leadership team. Most of them were expertly handled before they ever manifested as noticeable problems. And they were entirely handled by me. It was not merely because I was the only individual technically capable of doing the work. It was because I was the only one who consistently stayed late, the one who possessed the deep institutional knowledge, the one who flatly refused to let the critical infrastructure fall apart under immense pressure. Sitting alone in that quiet conference room, staring blankly at the empty white space on the paper where my hard-earned bonus should have been printed, I fully realized a harsh truth I had deliberately ignored for several years. The executive leadership knew exactly what I did. They fully understood my role. They simply did not value it. They did not value it in a tangible way that actually showed up when the company experienced massive financial success. They did not value it in a way that offered me any genuine protection or respect. And once that specific thought firmly settles into your mind, it radically changes how you view every single interaction that comes next. Because if the incredibly stressful work that literally holds the entire company together does not financially count, then what exactly are you sacrificing your time and sanity to hold together? Julian Thorne formally joined the corporate leadership team on a mundane Monday morning. By that same Friday afternoon, he was already firmly seated in the exact high-level strategy meetings I had spent 19 exhausting years actively working toward. He confidently walked into the corporate office with the specific kind of unearned arrogance that absolutely does not come from decades of practical, hands-on technical experience. It came entirely from smooth presentation skills. He utilized incredibly clean corporate language, wore impeccably tailored sharp suits, and consistently presented brightly colored slides that looked like they were specifically designed to thoroughly impress easily swayed people who intentionally did not ask too many difficult questions. He was officially introduced to the staff as a critical strategic hire. That was the precise, carefully chosen phrase the executive board deliberately used. Not operational, not technical. Strategic. It sounded incredibly important. It sounded remarkably elevated, but in practical reality, it also meant he absolutely did not have to understand how anything in our complex back-end actually functioned. At first, I did not think much of his sudden arrival. Large, sprawling companies bring in highly paid people exactly like him all the time. Some of them genuinely try to learn the complex intricacies of the business. Most of them, unfortunately, do not. What truly mattered to me was whether they possessed the basic humility to quietly listen to the veteran experts when things inevitably went wrong. Julian completely lacked that basic humility. In his second busy week, we all sat in a critical planning session for a massive, high-stakes client rollout. The rigid timeline was dangerously tight. The fragile legacy system had severe hidden limitations that were not remotely obvious unless you had personally worked with it under intense pressure during an actual crisis. I carefully started to explain exactly where the specific technical risks were actively hiding. He politely nodded, smiled condescendingly, and patiently let me finish my sentence. Then he smoothly turned his expensive chair to the rest of the crowded room and loudly proclaimed that we needed to be far more aggressively proactive in intelligently aligning our vast operational capacity with the projected market demand. The entire room enthusiastically nodded in unified agreement. It was the exact same fundamental idea I had just clearly articulated, just repackaged with different, vastly more expensive corporate words. Now it magically sounded exactly like his own original, brilliant strategic concept. I deliberately did not publicly correct him in front of the executive team. There was simply no logical point. That is unfortunately how these brutal corporate environments actually function. Public credit always follows smooth clarity and confident positioning, absolutely not the actual technical origin. But his subtle undermining definitely did not stop there. A few weeks later, during another highly tense technical meeting, I accurately pointed out a severe logical flaw in a newly proposed system change. It was seemingly something small on the surface, but it would have rapidly created massive, cascading delays once the daily processing volume inevitably increased. Julian arrogantly leaned back in his comfortable leather chair and loudly declared that I was getting far too deep in the weeds. He confidently stated that we all desperately needed to remain sharply focused on the much bigger strategic picture. Too deep in the weeds, that was his deliberate, calculated way of publicly saying my highly technical work simply did not belong in a high-level executive room. The massive, glaring problem was that the tangled weeds were exactly where the real, incredibly expensive catastrophic issues actually lived. If you intentionally ignore the weeds long enough, they quickly stop being small, easily manageable annoyances. They rapidly become impossibly expensive disasters. But the entire executive room immediately shifted their unwavering support to him. That was the specific part that truly mattered the most. Because he consistently spoke with unwavering, completely unearned confidence. Because he flawlessly used the exact right corporate buzzwords. Because the senior leadership had already firmly decided he was the shining future of the technology department. I quietly watched it all happen slowly, week by week. My official technical role definitely did not change on any printed paper. My corporate title frustratingly stayed exactly the same. But in those crucial meetings, my seasoned voice slowly started to carry significantly less weight. Innovative technical ideas, I carefully brought up desperately needed public validation from someone exactly like him before they were taken seriously by the board. Genuine, critical concerns I raised were quickly dismissed and negatively labeled as overly cautious operational thinking. Meanwhile, his completely baseless ideas were enthusiastically called forward-thinking, even when they were built entirely on wildly inaccurate assumptions that did not remotely match our actual technical reality. There was one specific meeting that finally made it crystal clear. We were intensely discussing a massive system update that would profoundly affect multiple massive clients simultaneously. I had already clearly seen what would inevitably happen if the complex code was aggressively pushed too quickly. I carefully explained the impending disaster. I kept it remarkably simple. I was incredibly direct. Julian condescendingly nodded again, then loudly declared that while he understood my minor operational concern, he felt we were severely underestimating our own unique ability to rapidly adapt in real time. The entire room foolishly agreed with his reckless optimism. Exactly 2 days later, he confidently presented a slightly revised version of the exact same rollout plan, miraculously with my specific technical concerns quietly included. It was now cleverly framed entirely differently. Now it was proudly called a balanced, heavily mitigated strategic approach. And this time, it was unanimously approved by the executive board. That is the exact moment I completely stopped seeing his behavior as a mere annoying coincidence. It was a calculated, deliberate pattern. The actual technical substance of my work was never the real problem. The corporate positioning was the problem, and Julian had already been perfectly positioned by the executives. The humiliating bonus meeting made vastly more logical sense after that stark realization. It was absolutely not just about the money. It was about who the company genuinely believed was actively driving real financial value, and equally important, who they falsely believed could be easily replaced without consequence. I was not being aggressively pushed out directly, at least, not yet, but I was definitely being quietly moved to the side. Smoothly, cleanly, in a highly calculated way that absolutely did not require any messy public confrontation. It was just a subtle shift in executive attention, a deliberate shift in corporate language, a noticeable shift in who exactly got actively heard in the important rooms. And the more closely I watched it unfold, the clearer the bitter truth became. This was absolutely not about actual technical performance. It was entirely about corporate perception, and the internal perception in that massive glass building had already been firmly decided. The automated system alert violently chimed in at exactly 11:43 in the evening. It was the exact same piercing tone as always, the exact same critical monitoring system, the exact same kind of complex back-end issue I had personally seen and manually fixed dozens of times before. A cascading process failure that would start remarkably small and rapidly spread like a vicious virus if it was not handled immediately. For 19 years, my immediate response was completely automatic. Laptop instantly flipped open. Complex server logs quickly pulled up. The silent, undocumented fix already in rapid motion before anyone else in the entire company even knew there was a problem. That particular night, however, I simply sat there for a few seconds longer than usual. The living room was perfectly quiet. My house possessed that deep, comforting stillness it only gets incredibly late at night when absolutely everything settles down. I stared blankly at the glowing laptop screen. Then I thought deeply about that humiliating meeting. I thought about the vast, empty blank space on that printed page. Due to broader budgetary realignments, I knew exactly what technically needed to be done to avert the crisis. I just did not physically move my hands to type the code. Not right away. Instead, I calmly did something incredibly simple. I strictly followed the official corporate process, exactly as it was formally written in the outdated manual. I properly logged the system issue. I formally flagged it to the designated on-call technical team. I added a brief, polite note. It was completely clear, it was entirely professional, it was technically complete. Then I simply closed the heavy laptop. It honestly did not feel overly dramatic. There was absolutely no massive rush of intense emotion, just a very small, profound internal shift. For the first time in 19 exhausting years, I was not voluntarily stepping outside my strictly defined official role to quietly protect the broken system from itself. If they truly wanted rigid corporate structure, they could finally have it, exactly as defined. No extra effort, no invisible uncompensated work. The very next morning, my corporate inbox was flooded with frantic messages. Did you see this massive error? Any idea what caused it? Can you take a quick look? I calmly responded the exact same way each and every time. I politely informed them that I had properly logged my technical notes and that the designated on-call team was currently reviewing this situation. Polite, direct, strictly within the exact scope of my job description. By mid-morning, the unresolved issue had predictably grown much worse. Nothing catastrophic yet, but definitely enough to cause massive processing delays. Enough for the senior executives to start paying serious attention. In the long past, that is exactly where I would silently step in, quietly fix it behind the scenes, make it magically disappear before it ever reached the elevated level of an executive meeting. This time, I resolutely did not. Not because I technically could not. Because I consciously chose to step back. Around lunchtime, I finally received a frantic, overly casual message directly from Julian. "Hey Richard, can you quickly jump on this annoying issue for a bit? Just need a quick, easy fix. A quick, easy fix." I stared hard at the demanding message for a long moment, then calmly typed back. I informed him that I had already fully documented the complex issue and the recommended next steps, and that the dedicated on-call team should be perfectly able to handle it. Absolutely no emotion, no long defensive explanation, just the cold, hard truth. A few tense minutes later, another desperate message popped up. He aggressively stated that while my notes were appreciated, the department could really use my deep technical expertise on this specific matter. That loaded word again, expertise. The exact same valuable expertise that apparently did not qualify for a financial bonus. I did not reply right away. It was not a petty attempt to make a dramatic point, simply because I genuinely did not feel that old, familiar urgency anymore, and that lack of urgency was entirely new to me. That profound internal shift, it was not loud, but it was incredibly real. Later that stressful afternoon, I quietly stepped out of the chaotic office for a coffee. I sat alone in my car for a few quiet minutes before going back inside. That is exactly when my personal phone buzzed. It was a name I had not seen in a very long while, Simon Keller. We had worked closely together many years ago, before he left for a massive, aggressive competitor. He was a highly intelligent guy who truly understood complex architecture the exact same way I did. The message was incredibly simple. He said he had heard things were going well over there, and asked if there was any chance I would be open to a quiet conversation. I read the short text twice. Not because I did not understand the clear implication, but because of the incredible timing. 19 years in one single place, and I had never once seriously considered leaving. Not really. There had certainly been lucrative offers before, casual conversations, but absolutely nothing that made me seriously think about walking away from the massive infrastructure I had painstakingly built. This specific message felt entirely different. Maybe it was because of that humiliating boardroom meeting. Maybe because of that disrespectful blank space. Maybe because for the first time in my life, I genuinely was not sure what exactly I was staying for anymore. I did not immediately reply. I just sat there in silence, holding the phone tightly in my hand, the car engine off, thinking deeply about how incredibly quickly things can completely change when you finally stop endlessly doing what you have always done. When I finally returned to the chaotic office, the unresolved system issue from the night before was still being frantically discussed. Vastly more people were involved now, demanding more answers, applying much more pressure. And for the very first time, I was calmly watching the entire disaster unfold from the absolute outside. I was not completely detached, just no longer taking personal responsibility for their failure. That was the invisible line I had drawn, and once I firmly crossed it, I knew deep down there was absolutely no going back to how things used to be. Because the broken system had not fundamentally changed. The highly lucrative offer from the competitor arrived precisely on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:18. It was a formal, heavily encrypted email featuring a clean legal structure and absolutely no unnecessary corporate language. I opened the document once, then slowly read it through again. The final number printed on the page was astonishingly real. The base salary alone was nearly double what I was currently making. When combined with the guaranteed signing bonus and the generous equity package, the total compensation pushed incredibly close to 3 times my current earnings. But it was not just about the massive amount of money. It was about how the entire role was respectfully framed. They were not simply offering me a standard technical position. They were actively asking me to aggressively build an entirely new architectural structure from the ground up, granting me full, uncontested ownership of the complex systems I would be personally responsible for designing. It came with incredibly clear authority, absolutely clear expectations, and a profound respect for the deep expertise I brought to the negotiating table. There was absolutely no vague mention of budgetary alignment, no empty corporate promises about future potential, just a direct, undeniable acknowledgement of my true technical value. I firmly sent my formal resignation email at exactly 8:07 on a Wednesday morning. The subject line simply read, "Resignation Notice." There was absolutely no long, emotional explanation, no trace of bitterness in the careful wording, just a completely clear statement of my final date and a polite offer to facilitate a structured transition. By exactly 8:19, my previously empty calendar began rapidly filling up with frantic meetings. First human resources, then my direct executive manager, then a desperate request for a quick sync with Julian that quickly devolved into a chaotic 45-minute interrogation. The general tone across the company was entirely different from anything I had ever heard before. It was panicked, highly urgent, and entirely focused on damage control. "Richard, this is completely unexpected," my manager nervously said, sitting across from me with his trembling hands folded much tighter than usual. "Is there absolutely something we can strategically address here to change your mind?" I kept my answer remarkably simple. "I have officially accepted another offer." Julian aggressively leaned forward, his polished composure visibly cracking. "If this is primarily about compensation, we can immediately revisit that," he frantically promised. "We deeply value what you bring to this department." Now finally, the concept of value was desperately placed on the table, a mere week after I had been blatantly left out of the executive bonus entirely. "I appreciate the sentiment," I calmly replied, "but the final decision has already been formally made." The remainder of the tense conversation predictably shifted to frantic transition planning and desperate requests for comprehensive documentation. Over the next several grueling days, the underlying tone across the entire company drastically changed. The minor system issues quickly escalated into massive, cascading failures. The complex operations were no longer smooth. Severe friction had entirely replaced flow. Julian's polished confidence completely evaporated as he proved entirely incapable of managing the fragile systems without my constant, invisible interventions. On my absolute final day, Julian smugly cornered me in the hallway. "We will just continue utilizing the core node diagnostic software you installed," he arrogantly stated, referring to the critical proprietary tool I had personally coded at home years before joining the firm. "It is fully integrated into our systems anyway." That was the exact moment I smoothly dropped the devastating legal hammer. I calmly handed him a formal, legally binding cease and desist letter drafted by my expensive attorney. "Actually, Julian, you absolutely will not," I clearly stated, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet corridor. "I developed CoreNode entirely on my own personal equipment on my own time, well before I ever signed an employment contract here. Under Title 17 of the United States Code, Section 106, I solely hold the exclusive copyright. You never possessed a formal license. My previous, unspoken permission for this company to utilize my intellectual property is hereby officially revoked, effective immediately." The blood instantly drained from his face as the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic legal and operational disaster fully dawned on him. Without CoreNode, their entire fragile back-end infrastructure would effectively collapse within days. They were suddenly facing not only massive system failures, but also the terrifying prospect of severe copyright infringement litigation if they dared to continue using my code. 3 weeks later, I was comfortably settled into my massive new corner office at the competitor, earning triple my previous salary. Through reliable industry contacts, I quickly learned the satisfying aftermath. Without my proprietary software and my constant manual fixes, my former company's systems had catastrophically crashed. Julian was unceremoniously fired for gross incompetence and for exposing the company to massive legal liability. In a desperate attempt to keep their servers running while they frantically attempted to build a viable replacement, the executive board was ultimately forced to pay me an absolutely astronomical, legally binding licensing fee just to temporarily use CoreNode for 6 months. I did not execute this plan purely out of spite. I did it because I finally understood the fundamental rules of the corporate game. They had callously shown me exactly what they believed I was worth when they handed me that blank sheet of paper. I simply decided to legally show them what my true value actually cost on the open market. And in the end, the ultimate math was undeniably clear.